Hey everyone, welcome to Film Paper Topics with Ken Crater. For those of you who are coming over from TikTok and know me as Fun Film Facts with Ken Crater, I'm glad you made it over to YouTube. For those of you who have been on YouTube watching my shorts diligently, the few of you that there were, I appreciate that you're tuning into my longer show now, Film Paper Topics, and now you know why all the YouTube shows that I've been sharing, the shorts, have all been addressed to TikTok followers because I make those videos for TikTok and then I share them on YouTube. So this is going to be the show that's exclusively to YouTube instead, so now it's your turn to have something that's just yours. For today's film paper topic, we're going to discuss Radio Flyer, directed by Richard Donner. But before we get into Radio Flyer, I wanted to briefly explain why I chose the name Film Paper Topics. And the reason is because I studied film at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and I took cinema studies courses, a lot of them. My degree is comprised of a number of things, I won't get into that. But I studied under a particular professor mostly, and his name was Dr. Vincent Vituro, and he was an expert in cinema. One of the few people that knew not just more about movies than I did, but way more about movies than I did. So I kind of looked at him as a mentor of sorts, but whenever one of us in class would come up with an idea or a reading or an analysis of a film, we would start talking about it, and when we got into it, he would stop us and say, "That sounds like a good paper topic, though." Which was his way of saying, shut up. Because one, if we all just sat there and started talking about our ideas about film, we wouldn't get anything accomplished in class. And two, he wanted us to actually curb those ideas so that we could use them for analysis in our essays that we had to write for his classes. So, getting into Radio Flyer, directed by Richard Donner and written by Mikey Evans, who have both, I will point out, before we get into this any deeper, that they have said individually that the reading of this film that they prefer is the straightforward, literal interpretation of the events of Radio Flyer. A little boy is abused by his stepfather. Him and his brother build a flying machine out of a Radio Flyer wagon. They take it down a huge ramp. He goes into the sky and flies away to go live a life of adventure on his own at the age of 8 years old. It's kind of ridiculous, but that is their version of the story that they say is going on. But something to take into consideration. This film was marketed as a family-friendly film. When it went to the box office and the first wave of people went to see this family-friendly film, they caught on really quickly to the fact that it was not family-friendly. What this was an incredibly dark story about child abuse. And if you don't read it literally, which almost nobody does, you see a movie about a kid who ends up dead. So the first wave of people went and seen this movie, went and told their friends, no, I don't recommend that you take your kids to see that movie. That's not what we thought it was going to be. And then it became a box office flop, only to become a sleeper film and a cult classic later on after it made its way to VHS and television. So as such, I think it's safe to say that Richard Donner was taking the stance on the events of the film as being literal in order to stay in line with the marketing approach, because after this flopped at the box office, the only way the movie was going to make money was from rentals and people buying the VHS or eventually the DVDs, or now buying it on streaming and so forth. The only way that this movie makes money is if people buy it. If people think that it's a dismal movie that's actually designed to make you depressed and sad, they're not going to be as likely to buy it. So I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening, but I am going to say that it definitely falls into the realms of possibility that he is saying this in order to help the movie make money. But I will definitely say, I think he's definitely saying it to make it easier on people who are more sensitive to this subject matter, which is incredibly touching. So I do think that Richard Donner went public and said his analysis of this film as being a literal interpretation because of the negative feedback that resulted in people going to see the movie to find out that this family-friendly film was actually about a kid getting beat on and then maybe even dying. For that to be the movie that people are going to go buy, it's going to be bought a lot less. And as such, Richard Donner is going to try to augment that as best he can. Because the film he made is framed a very different way. For instance, we have the character of Mikey as an adult telling his children in a way to brace them for the story he's about to tell them that it's a lie. He says this by saying, history is all in the mind of the teller. Truth is all in the telling, which is his way of saying what I'm about to tell you is my perspective and my imagination running wild with the events of my childhood in a way that makes it so that you can understand this in a way that's not devastating to you to find out that my stepdad was beating the crap out of my brother to the point where he killed him one day. Directly after, Mikey explains to his kids that what he's about to tell them is indeed going to be fabricated to a large extent. He then goes into an urban legend to give it even less validity as a story. And this is the story of Fisher, a kid from Novato, California that they heard about after they got to town. And this kid's story was that he and a group of friends took a bicycle up to the top of the same hill that they're going to use to launch the flyer. And then he takes that bicycle down and ramps this barn roof, trying to grab what looks like trying to grab the bottom of an aircraft's landing gear as it takes off. What his end game would have been is completely unknown to me, or probably him, and the events that you see look completely insane. But he misses it and then falls what looks like about 50 to 100 feet. It's very dramatic seeing the fall, and then he breaks his leg, seemingly damaging it forever, as we would find out by the end of the movie when he makes a small appearance as an adult. But in this moment, they go to black and white because it's typical to show black and white when you're dealing with a flashback. However, what I find interesting about using black and white cinematography at this point in the film is that when we cut to present day Bobby, Mikey, and their mom in the car driving to Novato, we're still in black and white. We don't cut to color to illustrate that we're now in the contemporary setting. We actually stay in black and white while Bobby does this hand business out the window to illustrate that he's pretending his hand is flying across the air that's blowing by the car as they drive down the highway. This is interesting because this illustrates a segment of the movie that sort of transitions from black and white to color in the same way that Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz transitions from the tan, almost black and white sepia look of the beginning of that film to the vibrant Technicolor that would be Oz, the fantasy of the movie. There's one part of this movie that doesn't really have too much to do with the general dark plot of this movie that takes place after they get to California. That has always kind of pissed me off. And although they do what they can to remove Lorraine Bracco's character, who plays the mom, from any culpability regarding Bobby's abuse, at least until she takes the king back after he put her son in the hospital. But before they get to California, on their way from Jersey, she has a wedding ring in her hand and she takes it off and she's playing with it. There's no green around her finger to indicate that this ring is not made of gold. It seems and appears to be made of actual gold. While her kids are in the back seat, bickering almost over who should get the last saltine cracker covered in peanut butter because it's all they have to eat for the entire trip. It's jars of peanut butter and saltine crackers. She takes this wedding ring and she just kind of casually flips it out of the car into the street while they're driving. And I understand that it's 1969 and that there were significant problems with pawn shops before the Consumer Care Act of 1974. But she couldn't get a couple bucks for this ring somewhere? She couldn't stop somewhere on the way between Jersey and California and say, hey, can I get a few bucks for this ring so I can buy my kids some food so they don't have to eat peanut butter in the car tonight? But instead, she just kind of casually throws it out the car. And it's just like, what are you doing, Mom? I don't get it. This is one of the weirdest moments, and I understand that it's there to display that she has a sentiment toward her ex-husband, who is no longer in the picture, and it gives you a he went out for ice cream one day and never came back vibe when they're talking about it in this moment, but still, come on. Now, as a child watching this movie, I never really looked beyond the surface. I know it made me sad, and I remember finding the moment where Bobby's hit for the first time by the king while they're fishing to be particularly jarring. But I never saw it as anything other than what it was, which is what I think most people want it to be. There were also a lot of questions and confusions that I had after he left. Like, why did he never come back to see his mom and Mikey when he was a kid? He was only a kid. Wouldn't he miss his mom and his brother? Also, how does he get money for food and gas for the lawnmower engine that he's running his airplane on? If he lands, can he take back off again because he doesn't have a ramp? Does he know how to land an airplane? Things like that. What does he do for food for Samson, the tortoise that was with him, which is something I'll get back to. But how ridiculous it all was never really dawned on me. And I just kind of chalked it all up to Bobby doesn't have an address, so they can't tell him that the king is in prison and never coming back, and things like that. But it never dawned on me how absurd the actual plot was that was going on in this movie as I was watching it as a child. Upon screening this film as an adult, my interpretations of the material became drastically different. I no longer saw it as a straightforward literal movie, and I noticed the fantasy elements a lot more, and why they were there became way clearer to me. But I read into the movie and I started looking up other people's take on the movie. And after doing this, I noticed that there were approximately four different readings of the film that you could take seriously. There's many other readings of the film, but I would go as far to say that many of them are facetious and people poking fun at the people who are actually taking an interpretation from the movie that isn't literal. So the first interpretation we'll refer to as the literal interpretation. And that's when Mike and Bobby design an aircraft out of a radio flyer wagon to escape their evil stepfather who's excessively abusing Bobby. They use scraps from around town, the wagon, a motor that they find from an old lawnmower in an abandoned barn, and then the side views and some other things off of the king's bike while he's in prison after beating Bobby near to death the first time. Then they take this machine to the top of a hill and then roll it down so that it can pick up enough speed to ramp off of a barn rooftop, and then it takes flight, allowing Bobby to fly away to safety forever. Then Bobby sends postcards to let everybody know he's okay, even though he has no food or money. Interpretation number 2, Bobby's death number 1. And that's that everything in the movie is happening quite literally as the surface narrative would suggest. But after the moment they take Bobby to the top of the hill with the flyer and release him down the ramp, he actually crashes and then dies. Now, there is a huge problem with this reading, which is why I don't actually think it holds much water, and that's that Bobby had the tortoise Samson with him in the flyer when they took off. The dog, Shane, hopped out to take on the king when the king was trying to stop them from doing what they were doing. But Samson was still in there. So if Bobby had died in a crash that was bad enough to kill him, there's a good chance, if not a better chance, that he would have died as well rather than lived. Even though he is a tortoise and he has a shell, he was probably not going to make that crash. However, in addition to that, at the end of the movie, Mikey's kids say, "Is that where we got Samson?" And then Tom Hanks, as adult Mike, says kind of reluctantly, yeah, that's where we got Samson. Almost as if he had accidentally given away the key to his story's flaw, illustrating that what he is saying is indeed a farce, and now the kids have the key to unlocking the puzzle of his lies. Interpretation number 4. This is my runner-up for the interpretations to number 3, which is the one that I go with, but this is the one that I like second best. After posting my video to TikTok, I noticed there were several people in the comment section that were suggesting this interpretation, and then I read up on it a little bit and looked into it and found there's a lot of people that actually take this interpretation as their interpretation of the film. And that's that Bobby never existed. Mike dreamt him up as a coping mechanism so that Mike could deal with an out-of-body scenario while he was being beaten by the king himself, and that eventually he goes to Children's Services or the police to let them know that the king is abusing him again after the king already went to prison for almost killing him the first time. And they put him in prison, and he stays in prison this time, and he and his mom live happily ever after. But the things about this that don't quite add up is the postcards and everything, unless the postcards are just another thing that he's making up for his kids so that they can interpret this in a way that's friendlier than the literal reality that actually took place with him in this scenario with his stepfather. Samson being in the possession of Mike and his kids at the end of the movie is an illustration not only that option 2 or interpretation 2, Bobby's death number 1, is moot and doesn't work, but the first reading being literal, showing Bobby taking the tortoise with him, can't really make any sense if they had the tortoise. It just illustrates that Mike used their tortoise as a vessel for telling the story, as a small element of truth that would bring gravity to his story, but he didn't quite do it well enough and right. And as such, the kids now see that there's a flaw in his story that will later on become the key to realizing that dad was lying to us about the situation. So I would say interpretation one and interpretation two are sort of debunked by the concept of Samson being with the kids and Mike. Which brings me to interpretation number three, which is the interpretation I think holds the most water. And that's that there never was a radio flyer wagon. Mike and Bobby happen to be separated at some point after the mom brings the king back into her life after he gets out of prison. And then he starts drinking and then lays into Bobby, this time not putting him into the hospital, but putting him in the morgue. Bobby doesn't survive, and that the stories that they tell and the postcards are actually being sent by Mike to his mom as Mike travels so that his mom will feel better and they can make up a story about Bobby having survived because they can't cope with the reality that Bobby was killed by the stepfather. So, although we have a writer and a director who both interpret this film one way, they take it the literal way that the events play out. Many people may want to go with that direction and make that their interpretation as well, but it's not a filmmaker's place to interpret the material for their audience. My film professor back at MSU Denver would often quote Federico Fellini, who said, "As storytellers, it's our duty to bring them to the station. There, they will each person choose their own train." I leave you with that, and I hope you guys enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next time. Join me for more fun film paper topics. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Ba-ba. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba.